Hi, I'm Aziz Amna. I'm a writer and the novelist of American Fever. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here. I've read from very early childhood, and that's sort of course, like not everyone who reads and goes on to become a writer, but I think anyone who is a writer most likely has been a voracious reader in their childhood. And so I just used to read a ton. I just remember being specifically just so hungry for books throughout my childhood because they were also, I wouldn't say they were like a very scarce resource, but they were not as like now I feel very lucky that, okay, I have access to all these public libraries in the US and I can buy any book that I want and whatnot. But at that time, it was very much like you had, very few libraries. I remember my mother on the weekends, we'd like go to these like old bookstores in the center of town, and like whatever was there was what you got. And so I just remember specifically this like hunger for books that was just constant for me and both my brothers. So we read a ton, and then when I was in my early teens, I started writing these like short like letters to the editor, or just like short what I thought were funny articles for like the children's section of the magazines. And then I like always, then there was the sort of like 2010s like blog world, and I was part of that, and just like writing stuff for the internet, even if it was just for the 5 people who read it. And then, so when I got into college, I decided to major in English, and I took a lot of literature classes. I wrote, but I think it was still very much something that I like thought I was going to do on the side of the other stuff that I did in life. And that continued for the first few years after college, because I was born and raised in Pakistan. I came here for college, and so once I graduated, I had the classic visa issues, and I need to get a job that will give you, sponsorship, and very, very few jobs in the like writing, publishing world will do that. So I worked in corporate America for a few years, was trying to do writing on the weekends and evenings, but then wanted to give it more time if I could. And so then I applied for a master's in fine arts, got into that program for creative writing. And that's when what that program did was that it gave me 3 years of financial freedom and time to sort of commit to a bit larger project than just essays or short stories. And that's when I finished the book, edited it, sold it, and it came out last year.
Wow,
yeah.
It's quite a journey to get into writing and everything. So tell me about what inspired your book.
Yeah, so as is, I think, the case with a lot of first novels, this one is rooted in a lot of autobiography. So basically, American Fever is the story of a young Pakistani girl who moves from urban Pakistan, like a city in Pakistan, to rural Oregon in the US for an exchange year. And while she's there, she gets terribly sick. And so it's like the story is about culture shock and assimilation, or the pressure to assimilate. And just like sort of moving away from your family for the first time. It's very much a coming of age story, but told from the perspective of someone also moving countries, like not just growing older, but also like moving. And so I had a very similar experience. When I was in high school, I did a year-long exchange program that also took me to rural Oregon. Everything that happens in the book, besides that initial setup, is obviously all fiction. So like the characters that she meets there, the host parents, all of that is just totally different. But the sort of the seed for the novel was my own life.
Wow, and so what inspired the title?
So the disease that Hira, the protagonist, ends up getting, and I don't think this is not a spoiler at all because it's literally told in the first page, is tuberculosis. Which and I wanted to have that disease because it's very, I don't know if you know, but it's until quite recently it was quite prevalent in South Asia, and it's still, I think South Asia still has the biggest burden of TB cases in the world. Thankfully it's not a huge disease or concern in the US. So I wanted to take this disease that has like a huge history. It's like a very ancient disease. There was a time when it had killed like 1 in 8 people that had ever lived. throughout history. Like so there's a lot of baggage to the disease. There's a lot of, at one time it was just like ravaging Europe, and like killing off like all these, there was a huge association between artists and tuberculosis, and so it was almost thought of as like this creative disease, even though I think the reason why a lot of artists were dying was because they were poor and so they like didn't have enough health resources. But thankfully there was a very effective antibiotic that was, I think it was around the 1950s, and so since then it has become less and less of an issue, but it still continues to be a huge issue in certain parts of the world. So I wanted to take this like very kind of, to me, politically charged disease, and one of the main symptoms of the disease, which is how like you first realize that you have it, is like this fever that will not go away. So that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is, growing up, I remember this concept of American fever, which is like this obsession with America and this like idea of like American dream, or like sort of a fixation on American culture and all of that. So like it felt like a way to tie in those two themes.
Is there anything in your family that indicated that you were going to be a writer one day, or like is this like in your blood? Like I'm curious on the origin of you in that way.
Yeah. So I know that it's unfortunately very common within, I think, South Asian families, or at least South Asian families in the diaspora, that there's this feeling that like people are encouraged obviously to choose very, very stable careers over the arts. And thankfully that was not the case for me growing up. And so my parents are both, especially my father is a huge reader himself. And so my father, I think from him came this inspiration to read, because we constantly saw him read all the time, and then he would like share anecdotes from the books that he was reading. And so that was like something that we were aspiring to from his side. And then from my mother, which I think it's funny, because I think going back to this theme of like, women versus men and what women do, I think my mother was doing a lot more of the practical stuff of like making sure that we had the books, like taking us to those bookstores and getting us to this. I remember specifically she used to teach at this college, and it had a really good library, which is very, very uncommon, or hopefully things have changed since, but at that time it was very uncommon for there to be such a well-stocked library associated with just a school. And so like every weekend she would ask the librarian there if we could just go there and sit there for hours, and then we'd check out way more books than were allowed on one library card. And so I think my mother was always encouraging that reading in very practical ways. So from the very beginning. And then I remember when I would write just those small things for the magazines, it was always sort of a cause for celebration in the family. Like my father would make me read it out anytime someone came over to the house, and like, like the way you're asked to sing nursery rhymes, I'd be like brought in with a piece of paper. And I have very, very good memories of that, and I think that was so important in encouraging me to be a writer. And then I think, there's also, for me, it's very hard to sort of untie my identity as a writer from my identity as an immigrant, because because again, like this book is, it's not really about migration as such, because the protagonist is in the US for a 10-month program, and then she's going to go back, so she's more of a visitor. But for me, because I moved here when I was 18, and so that was obviously such a fundamental and foundational part of my life, that I think that a lot of my desire to write also comes from this place of like trying to remember places, or trying to recollect my history, or trying to like sort of make a sense of what I've lost and what I've gained in this movement. Yeah.
Wow. And so you said that your father was a huge reader.
Yeah.
Was he also a writer? Or?
So yeah, it's funny because my father's first book literally came out like 4 months after mine. He did that very practical, which he had to. Like, he was from the village. There was no way he was going to be, have the privilege that I do now of just writing for a living, or like trying to make a living as a writer. So he throughout his life, he did like a very stable like civil service job, and he read his entire life voraciously, would sometimes write on the sides, but only after, and then once he retired, he sort of committed to like he started writing these essays. And what's funny about these essays is that they're all written on WhatsApp, so he like will type it out on his phone, and then he'll send them to like his friends to like check them, and then those like WhatsApp essays are now compiled in a book form. It came out, and like a lot of people really liked it, and so it's been like kind of really fun that both our books came out literally within months of each other. Yeah.
How beautiful is that?
Yeah.
That's incredible. So do you guys like share that experience of like, what is this publishing thing? Like, how does this work? Like,
Yeah.
how does this whole world work?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's been a very, because he got published in Pakistan, and so it's in some ways it's very different, but also like a lot of it, it's just like he had a book launch and I had a book launch, and you know, like what are the things that people relate to, or what are the kinds of questions that you get asked, or so it's been very cool to sort of see that those two things happen in parallel.
Yeah. So like, what do you feel like you've learned from him, especially being a writer?
Yeah. I mean, I think I read this quote the other day that I think that said something to the effect of writers are born in families where it is understood that language has power, and so I think this idea that I think from the very beginning, the way he talked about language, like the way he shared poetry, the way he gave like, you know, shared anecdotes, the way he told jokes, there was always this sense that, okay, when you say something, or when like language means something, and that it can like change you, it can change your perception, it can give you beauty, it can give you meaning. And again, it's so funny because I don't think he was doing a lot of that. I mean, who knows, but like very intentionally. But I think the sense that he gave me from early on that like language has power has sort of translated into me being a writer.
When it comes to history, can you speak a little bit about like what language does, and like the importance of maintaining a language, or the importance of like knowing the roots?
I think about this so much, and I'm sure, you know, a lot of people, especially within South Asia and the diaspora, because you're constantly living between two, if not more than two languages. And I think that it's so hard to really, because I think the very sort of initial thing that we think is like, oh, you move from one place to another, or even for people within South Asia too at this point, because of, you know, just the way English is sort of encroaching upon every aspect of society, it feels like, oh, we're losing this language. And of course, there's no doubt that that's happening. At the same time, I think that if we look at history, historically, there's always been one language that people used for communication, and like that was the more official, like in the Mughal period, that was Persian, and then everyone still spoke their local languages, but anyone who was going to be communicating with the court, or anyone who had any position of power, had to know Persian. So it was, I think that in a lot of ways, what we live in now, which is like, okay, in South Asia, people use English to communicate officially, but at the same time, like at home, they speak another language. That has been the case for a long time too. So I guess what I'm saying is like it's not as bad as it sometimes feels, because that has usually been the case as well. And I think this idea of like that we should live our entire lives in any way just with one language is, I think, what is the unnatural in any one language, is what is sort of an unnatural dream to aspire to.
So you have children, right?
Yes.
So like when you teach your children about your language, like what is the best way to go about that? Like how do you feel like you can encourage them to speak English? You can, I think it's Urdu.
Yeah.
Encourage them to speak Urdu. Like how do you want to pass that on?
Yeah. Again, something I think way too much about.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm like, just got married. I'm like,
Yeah.
let's think about children.
Yeah. And it's such an issue. I mean, I think it's like across the board. It's one of the things that, you know, anyone who is, I mean, I don't know about other diasporas, but like a lot of South Asians who are living here, as soon as they get married or they have kids, like that's one of the things that's very top of the mind for them. and I think it's very, very hard, obviously. And it's hopefully, I'm hoping that it is going to be a little less hard than perhaps it was for the children, like people like you know, whose like parents came in, was a different America, where there was a certain stigma associated with foreign languages that were not European languages. And so I'm hoping that there's a certain confidence that like the kids growing up now here will have that was lacking at that time. That said, it's still like undeniably difficult, not even because of the stigma, just practically. Like if you're, you know, if you're going to school and no one's speaking it, if you're like turning on the TV and no one's speaking it, there's no way that, and I think a lot of it also just ends up being so specific to the child themselves. Like you hear stories all the time of one sibling being fantastic at the language and then the other one like barely being able to like get any of the grammar right. And so I think I think what I'm trying to do is just like do the very best that I can. Like I feel like language is so important to me that I feel the need to be a perfectionist when it comes to that, but also realizing that most likely my children's language will not be as good as I would have hoped it would be, just because of the very practical, you know,
Yeah.
facts of us living here.
So, describe to me your mental health journey.
Yeah. I mean, I so as I think as I feel like is now talked about a lot, it's very hard to sort of talk about mental health from the perspective of having lived in South Asia, because it's not a conversation there. I think it's because the conversation is just very different there. I think I was reading this really interesting article a couple of days ago that was about these women who go to a shrine in southern Punjab in Pakistan, and what they do is like they go to the saints there, and they constantly like the symptoms that they mention or the symptoms that they cry about are a lot of what we associate with, you know, anxiety or depression, like nausea. And but for them that can just like for them that can mean spirits, or that can mean, oh, that like if the saint, you know, gives me a certain amulet, it will heal this. And perhaps it does, right? Because you like, I mean, I don't know a lot about mental health, and I don't know how these things work. And but it's a lot of it is also, if it is, you know, mind over matter or whatever, like maybe if those things actually help those people, that is a different definition of mental health than the way we perceive it here. So I think for me, it is very much a world that I'm extremely unfamiliar with right now, and I'm still learning about it. And this idea is very interesting to me of like what it can mean. I think I was reading through your previous issue, and you'd mentioned how going to therapy perhaps was not even that productive, right? And I've heard that so many South Asians say that when they attend therapy here, it's actually extremely counterproductive. They feel like the therapist does not understand them at all. It almost feels like they went several steps backwards in their journey. So it's just, I think, I'm glad that we're moving towards a more holistic understanding of what it can mean to, you know, look after your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you leaned on your spirituality or religion to help you look after your mind?
Yeah. So, I mean, religion has been extremely important, just not even necessarily just like on a spiritual level, but just, you know, because culturally in South Asia, as in most parts of the world, I think religion is just so deeply ingrained into your culture, so that you can't sort of separate one from the other. And I realized that only after I came here, because a lot of, because if you, so I don't consider myself a very religious person, but I think what I've realized that is that if you're in a separate, if you're like, you know, in a setting where your culture is not the dominant one and you're trying to replicate it, most of what that replication looks like is religious. So it's like, it's Eid or it's Ramzan or, you know, it's fasting and all of that. And so it's very hard to sort of separate those two. But in terms of how it's helped me, what's funny is that, so this book, which again is like based a lot on autobiography, when the girl gets sick, and she's going through this period, which I think is quite common in your teenage years, of sort of doubting everything and like having religious doubt and whatnot. And she finds herself reaching back towards all those things that she thought she'd given up or she didn't no longer believed in. And I think I have a similar experience of there are things that I have doubts about, but because those things are so deeply ingrained in me, anytime I am in a moment of desperate need, it's almost instinctual to like want to, you know, open up the prayer mat or want to have a conversation with God or any of that. Yeah.
That's a beautiful answer. How do you think you'll have those conversations at home? Like, do you think that they'll come to you, or do you think that you'll be able to like open up the conversation? But like, what does mental health look like maybe in the future with your kids and everything?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, honestly, I don't, I feel like, I mean, hopefully I'll do it well, but it's very hard for me to even envision that, just because, again, like, it was never talked about, not in a bad, like, not in a, oh, I'm traumatized by it kind of way. It just wasn't something that was directly verbalized. It's, you know, the way that people complain that, oh, there's no way to say I love you in my language or whatever, but it's like, no, your parents were probably saying that all the time. They just weren't saying I love you. They were probably like doing things for you that meant they loved you, or like, so it's like, I was taken care of in my childhood, of course, but I was, no one was ever like, oh, how's your mental health? Or like, are you...
It's a Western word.
Yeah. So I don't know what that's going to look like. Again, I'm hoping that, you know, we are living in a different world where these things are more approachable, but also, I mean, I totally see what you mean too about the laundry list thing. And it's interesting because it's sort of the way how I feel about religion too. It's this idea of how important is the ritual, because a lot of these, what you're saying about like the journal and the therapy and all of that, that also feels like you're just ritualizing mental health, right? Like, if I do this and this and this, that means that I've like done this. And it's tricky, right? Because I think rituals do also give you meaning or purpose, and that's like how a lot of people, it gives you a certain structure, just the way it gives your religion a certain structure. Like, what does it mean to believe if you're never praying, for instance? It probably, I mean, of course, there's way more to belief than the act of like getting down on your knees or however you pray. But I think that sometimes that ritual also has its own importance, or it gives you a certain structure. So it's, I don't know, I think a lot about how important the ritual itself is, or if there's a way to sort of not have the ritual and just like go directly for the thing. But perhaps that's not possible. I don't know.
It depends, right? Like, it depends on your relationship with God. Like, when you talk to God, like, do you feel like it's incomplete because I didn't do the ritual?
Right.
Like, when I'm doing the ritual, my mind's going elsewhere. It totally depends on like your relationship. And for me, I can feel myself becoming more traditional as the day goes by. Like, I can feel myself prioritizing the rituals for some reason more than I did when I was younger. But I think it's everyone's journey is so different, and like so, and it's definitely different than how we look at it historically. So I'm gonna just transition a little bit. So what does womanhood mean to you?
It's obviously, as is the case with everyone, it's evolved so much. I think that there's a certain time when, like, going back to, you know, all the way back to childhood, I think there's obviously for all women, there's like a certain moment in time. Perhaps it's when you get your period, or it's like there's a certain time when you realize that, okay, there is a divide. There's something that like puts you on the other side of the fence from the guys that you've been playing with all your life. And I think that, of course, that must happen everywhere. I think perhaps that is exacerbated in societies like Pakistan that are extremely, a lot of it is very segregated. It is an extremely patriarchal society. And so I remember for most of my teenage years feeling extremely burdened by the fact that I was a girl. And, you know, just the fact that you have a lot more limitations on what you can do and where you can go. And like I distinctly remember that both my brothers were, at some point, I don't know why, my parents had this idea of like getting them horse riding classes, which was just very, very, it's very, I don't know if a lot of people in Pakistan do that, but my parents really wanted my brothers. But I specifically remember that I was not enrolled in them. And I wonder now, like, I'm sure a lot of it was, you know, them just being concerned about my safety, that, oh, like, she's going to be with these men alone for the class. So a lot of it comes from a place of protection. But again, that is also a double-edged sword, because it's like you are protecting someone, but you're also making them feel like they constantly, you're not giving them that confidence then. So it's not that I blame my parents at all, but it's just one example that I can remember of just feeling like, okay, this is nothing but a burden. Like this is only there's only negatives associated with this, and it's so funny because a lot of these things sort of, you know, carry on generation to generation too. So I know that my mother, she went, because I remember once sharing this with her, and she said that yes, when I was growing up, she was like, all I wanted to be was a man. Like that is all I desired. And she tells this story of how, actually, I don't know, this is like the 70s or something in Pakistan, and someone in their class like transitioned from being a woman to a man, and I think like the entire classroom was just like, all the girls were so envious. Like everyone was like, oh my God, how do we do that? It was, I don't know, it's a very funny story, because it's like such a different context for that sort of conversation. But yeah, and then I came here, and I think there was definitely a certain freedom that I was able to get here, just like being able to walk openly on the street without worrying constantly. So I think that some of that burden sort of lessened. And then another huge shift obviously happened when I became a mother, because I think that's again when I like realized that, okay, there's a difference. Like my husband is a fantastic father, but at the end of the day, he's a father. And so there are certain things that one cannot do, two can't actually do as well as I can. And it's just interesting, because now I feel like so many people expect, you know, that there should be, I mean, I think equality, obviously it's a great thing to aim for. I just think that it comes sometimes in interesting contrasts with the fact that there are certain things that women, whether it is through, you know, they've been trained their entire lives to be a certain way, or whether it's biology or whatever it is, there are certain differences that you can't really eradicate. Yeah, I mean, I think that I just remember specifically with when I had my first child, and just going through that process and realizing just how hard it was. And then I distinctly remember being in the hospital room and feeling just this like wave after wave of rage, because I was like, oh my God, this is what all these women that I know have been through, and I've never heard of. Like, it's just, I've never heard their stories. And of course, like, I'm sure all of them have stories. It's just they like didn't feel like it was important enough to be talked about, or it was a little taboo to talk about it, or whatnot. And I was like, it is crazy to me that every single person who's been born in this world has had a woman behind them who like went through this to bring them to it's. So I think that was a very powerful, like, you know, moment of realizing what being a woman can mean.
Okay, so can you be a little bit more specific on what you wish you heard on that day?
Yeah. I mean, I think specifically around, I think there's just, I don't know, I think the process of whether it's childbirth or just like that early stage of motherhood, I think I don't know, it's very hard to describe it. I think it's just not something that is very frequently, or at least within my family, it was just never talked about. It was something that just happened to a woman, and then like and of course there's like always systems of support. Like when my mother, for instance, had us, like my grandmother flew to her, and like she was there for months. So it's not as if, you know, those structures and systems of support don't exist. It's just that there are certain silences around certain things. So it's like a woman's not gonna just like sit at the family table and like share her like birthing journey, or like, oh, how it was and how she recovered. And it's just like, that's not talked about. And I think that like especially for, I think, so my mother, like she's always been a very like professionally minded woman. And I think for her, it was just like, that's something that I'm just going to forget about and move on and raise my kids and, you know, have my job and all of that. So perhaps it was also just not important for her to talk about all of that. So I think it would have been great to have actually just heard those stories, so that I knew that, okay, you know, just what other people's experiences have been like.
Yeah. You're a daughter, you're a daughter-in-law, you're a mother. So like, how have those roles like changed your mindset as time has gone on? Like, did you feel a shift between each and every one of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure, and it's also funny how like one role or the expectations of one role change when you get on another role. So for instance, I think my family, like my parents probably felt more protective of me until I got married. And then now there's this idea that, okay, I'm slightly less their responsibility. Not in, you know, like of course they're still my parents, but the fact that like they think that, okay, we share this responsibility with someone else now. And I think that, and it's sort of the same way with this idea of being a daughter-in-law, that also changed a lot after I became a mother, because I think before I had still a very cordial but like a more casual relationship with my in-laws, who are fantastic. But I think that after I gave birth, and after like, especially when I had 2 kids, and I lean on them so much now for childcare and for support. And that's when, you know, you realize that, okay, how much you need those people around you, and how at the end of the day, I think, I mean, it's tricky, because I think you can't ever think of the binary between, you know, the individualism and like having a community, because of course, like, as I'm sure we can all agree on, like the very extreme of neither is good. But I think that when I came to the US initially, there's this like, you're almost heady on the individualism that this country affords you, that is so different from the very, very communitarian life of back home. But I think like after I had my kids, and after like seeing how so much of what I do is made possible through the support and kindness of other people, I just realized just how important it is to have that community, and that I think has definitely made me closer to my in-laws.
I'm so glad that you have that.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you're able to lean on them, and that's not always.
Oh yeah, exactly,
right?
Yeah.
But I want to take that and also just ask my big question, which is, from what we know historically and what we know today, how has the meaning of being a South Asian woman changed?
One thing that I wanted to talk about, that which I was thinking about that was, a lot of our culture has moved past this idea that, okay, the sort of like the trope of the girl boss, for instance, which is like, okay, you're doing everything exactly the way a man does, and therefore you should be paid the same way. Where I think what I have recently learned about. There's been this group of feminists in the US for a while who've been talking about this idea of wages for housework, which is that basically instead of trying to get women to do exactly what men do, which, I mean, of course, if that's what they want to do, they should do it. But the idea that, like, why would you not instead compensate them for the things that they wish to do if that does involve taking care of their own children or being at home, or just basically having that freedom and being compensated for it, like placing value on that thing. Like if you're saying that, okay, it is, if a woman's role is to, you know, take care of her kids if she wants to, then that should also be compensated in the same way as if she were working outside the house. And I think it's like, to me, it's been a very revolutionary idea, and it's taught me that, okay, there are like ways of thinking beyond this binary of like stay at home and look after your kids, or like, and I think a lot of that already exists, like the fact that we have like any kind of, which, I mean, this country is very bad at that, but we have any kind of parental leave that we have is already, you're compensating people for taking care of their families. So some of those things already exist, and how do we make that even more of a thing? But okay, going back to now the history thing. I think that so because a lot of my sort of upbringing was religious, and we were constantly hearing stories of, you know, the early days of Islam, and I think it's fascinating to me because I think so much of the way Islam is practiced in Pakistan today, unfortunately, is extremely patriarchal. But I think when we read a lot of the stories in the books, so many of them were about the women in early Islam, and so they were about the Prophet's wives, or the fact that you know, the very first person to convert to Islam was a woman, and she was a merchant at that time, so she was a divorced woman who had like her own business. Then like another woman is Zainab, who is the granddaughter of the Prophet, and she's considered like this person who sort of like, you know, stood up against evil, and like there's a sermon that she specifically gave that is now extremely well known, and she's considered like a huge example, a strong example of like a very, very brave woman in early Islam. And so it's yeah, I mean, I don't know, I think that dichotomy is so interesting to me, that now, of course, because so many of these things are politicized and used by the people who are already in power. So right now, this idea of like the way Islam is practiced in places like Pakistan, to me, feels extremely patriarchal. But a lot of the stories that we heard were very different from that. Yeah.
And that's very similar to Hinduism as well. Like the way that we hear about the stories of different women in our past, we're like, wow, you know, they had a lot of the same, now what it feels like a constraint, the
right.
roles that, you know, I want to be like that. I want to just be like that feminine woman all the time. But I think like this country does place a lot of like that binary on you sometimes. But no, that's great. I think, is there anything that you want to add to the interview at all?
No, I mean, I think we've covered everything. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great.
Perfect. That was
amazing. Thank you. No, I am desperate to return because although my disease lives deep within me, feeding on the hollow of my chest, all my pain and longing seem to radiate from far away. Home is where I have brought my illness from, the embers still glowing in its embrace. The past few months in Oregon feel like the snowflakes I eagerly lifted my fingers for in November, shimmery, ephemeral flecks that dissolved upon impact. The weight of my life is back there. The locus of grief is back there. And it pains me to write this because I will have to confront this over and over and over again my entire life. The mouth of the fall, the gleam of dawn, the spring of pain, it is all there. It will always be there.